Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Empire Edition. Now, just as a bit of a note, before we start up with the Empire Edition of the Missing Legendary Lords, I want to say I have mostly taken, for this list, the list of available characters in the 8th edition of the Warhammer tabletop game. That's primarily because the Empire has a lot of different characters in its stable, as it were. There are all the Elector counts, there are numerous champions that have appeared over the years, so there are characters who appear in Empire lore and do feature heavily within the Empire who won't be included on this list, but bear in mind I'm taking this from the 8th edition of the tabletop game, which seems to be the main inspiration from where Creative Assembly are getting their legendary lords and units and most of their information on how to build Total War Warhammer, it seems, at least at this point. So with that said, let's kick off with our first legendary lord, and we are starting out with Kurt Helborg. Now, Kurt is the Reichsmarschall, the Grand Marshal of the Reichsguard. He is the leader of the Emperor's armies, essentially the Empire's top general. Kurt is a lifelong military man. He's sort of been servicing the military all his life. He's fought everywhere from Araby to Kislev. He's fought all over the old world in terms of the campaigns he's gone on. He's described as being a tall and well-built man, towering over most sort of average height men. He does sport his fantastic headgear there, which is quite reminiscent of the Kislev Kossars, but as far as I'm aware is unrelated, and is just a bit of flair that Kurt likes to have on himself. He often rides upon his loyal steed, Krieglust, which is the grey gelding there you can see in the model. As his weapon, Kurt Helborg is armed with the Runefang Grudge Settler. You might be curious about this because Runefangs tend to be the weapons of Elector counts and Elector counts alone. Well, the story behind Kurt's Runefang is that there used to be a province in the Empire called Solund. The capital of Solund used to be Wildorf, to the south of the Empire, which is now part of Wissenland. Now, what happened with Solund is Solund got overrun by a goblin horde, a greenskin horde, not just goblins, and the Runefang was salvaged, but the province was a ruin and never recovered, and then got merged into the lands of Wissenland as we know it today. So there's a spare Runefang around, and that is being awarded by the Emperor to Kurt as his weapon of choice. As a legendary lord in Total War Warhammer, essentially Kurt would have to be unbreakable, because one of his traits on the tabletop game is if you put him in a unit of Reichsguard, he makes that unit unbreakable. So I think you'd have to translate that across and just make him as a unit unbreakable. Another item he has is the Laurels of Victory, I think they're called. Now, these are laurels blessed by a wizard of the Grey Order. This essentially serves to elevate his status. It seems to present some kind of illusion that makes him more intimidating to his enemies. Now, the way you could do that maybe on Total War Warhammer is make that item give negative leadership buff to the enemy so that they maybe break easier and have lower morale. I think that would be an interesting use of the Laurels of Victory, which Kurt has. He should be the best form of the Empire captain, just sort of an ultimate fighter. They say he is the best sword fighter in the Empire, second only to maybe a chap called Ludwig Schwarzhelm, I think it is. They're both cast as equals, as swordsmen. They're sort of on par with one another. No one's quite sure who would win in a fight, but it would be pretty close. Kurt, in essence, is one of the most experienced generals in the Old World. As I said, having campaigned all around the Old World from Araby to Kislev, he's also become one of Karl Franz's most trusted allies and friends in that time, making him kind of a key player in the goings-on of the Empire in the current Total War Warhammer timeline. I look forward to getting him, and I love his headgear, and I think he's a great-looking model and will be a lot of fun to have. Moving on, we have Marius Leitdorf. Now, I won't lie, Marius is a slight favorite of mine. He is the Mad Count of Averland. So, as the name may suggest, he is the Elector Count of Averland, and he is insane. He's a lunatic, for lack of a better term. Obviously, mental health professionals don't exist in the Total Warhammer world, so no one's quite diagnosed what's wrong with him. but he's said to be prone to bouts of melancholy and bouts of insane rage and screaming fits. Throughout his career as the Count of Averland, he has caused Karl Franz decidable amounts of trouble, often challenging other elected counts to fight, starting small skirmishes amongst the elected counts. He's also known for chasing imaginary foe, having been known to declare war on forests, as in just a normal forest, not necessarily like a whole bunch of tree men, just a normal plain forest that's not alive, swarms of bees, half-imagined armies of fishmen. And I think this is a great opportunity for Creative Assembly to possibly have a bit of fun. I'd love to see a quest battle where Marius turns up on the battlefield, gives one of the rousing speeches you see in the quest battle, and then the camera pans out to the enemy and there's just nobody there. And so it just stays on the battle map, an empty battle map with just your own army, with Marius facing off against nothing for about 3 minutes, and then the end of the battle, just to prove that he's a lunatic and to maybe confuse the player a little bit as well. I think that would be something, just an idea of some of the kind of fun stuff they could do with the mad Count Marius. Now, although he is a little bit mad, he is trusted by Karl Franz. One of the aspects that changed the way Marius behaves a little bit, to a certain extent, was in 2502 by the Imperial Calendar, which is essentially around the starting time of the Total War Warhammer game, around the time Karl Franz himself was crowned emperor. So it all kicks off around that time. And he savagely put down a halfling rebellion to such a confounding degree, such a harsh level, that Franz felt he had to act, he had to do something. So he sent his trusty bodyguard, Ludwig Schwarzhelm, to talk to Marius and essentially set up a system around Marius of advisors that would tell Marius, that would sort of curtail his odder behavior to a certain degree. But despite this, 10 years later, Marius was at it again. He went to Bretonnia this time. I think he was visiting the Duke of Paravon, commented on how ugly the Duke's wife was, and prompted the 2512 invasion by Bretonnia of the Empire. And I think that was resolved fairly quickly, but he has been known to start wars just due to some of the insane things he said and his lack of tact and diplomacy. He's also quite roguish when it comes to the females of the species. He's known to have acted improperly with a number of nobles' wives and daughters, and as such is rarely welcomed as a visitor to other nobles' houses. When this system of advisors was set up, Marius made a point of appointing his chief advisor. Now, his chief advisor was appointed as Daisy Kurt von Helborg II. Now, if that name seems familiar, it is because that name is taken after Kurt von Helborg, the Reichsmarshal of the Empire, and that is the name of Marius's horse. So his horse, named mockingly after the head of the Empire army, is his chief advisor, and he's been known to converse with his horse and seek its counsel on a number of things concerning the province of Averland. Marius Leitdorf and Kurt Helborg actually have such enmity that it's become slightly the stuff of legend within the Empire. Not only has he named his horse mockingly after Kurt Helborg, but has also been known to often and loudly pronounce that Helborg has a poor mustache, horrible dental hygiene, and has the sense of humor of a troll. He's known to dress in quite flamboyant clothing and colors. You can see the model painted here. I think you could even push that and make it even more flamboyant than the colors he's wearing there. But he, like all elected counts, is armed with a rune fang, no shield, but he tends to carry a secondary weapon, often portrayed as a dagger. So maybe make him a particularly damaging, maybe a frenzying kind of elected count stroke legendary lord. But he still has a lot of armor and plate and things like that. So maybe just deals out a bit more damage than your typical captain, but doesn't have a shield to protect him. So that's how you'd maybe have him on the tabletop. His rune fang is named Mother's Ruin, for anyone's interest. Actually, an interesting point about the lore with Marius is he's actually dead in current continuity. Before the end times, Marius dies. So technically, when Total Warhammer starts, he should be alive, but there comes a point where a horde of greenskins actually attacked through Blackfriar Pass, described as being as big as the horde that Sigmar himself fought at Blackfriar Blackfire Pass over 2,500 years before. In this battle, he had scouts watching the pass. He reported back to the Emperor. The Emperor sent aid. He sent several steam tanks, all the army of Altdorf, all the army of Reichsland. They arrived, but they're a bit too late. The Mad Count and all his great swords and all his army had been surrounded. The Count himself challenged the Orc war boss of the Horde to a duel and lost and died. Now, I don't think this will present too much of a problem for Total War Warhammer, as at the start of the game, he is alive, and I suppose you can just have him on your campaign and play it out for your own version of how things happened. But in the Warhammer tabletop continuity, Marius is dead, but was still included in the 8th edition, which was slightly puzzling to some people, but there you go. Now, although Marius is mad, he does have his uses. He does have a very sort of sharp mind and is a well-renowned poet and inventor in his own right. He's also known as a brilliant tactician and a fairly handy swordsman when it comes down to it. And when it does come down to the crux of things, he's often been there. And for as far as he can, Karl Franz does trust him as an ally to come to the defense of the Empire whenever he's called upon. I love Marius. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot of funny things for him on Total War Warhammer, and I look forward to seeing him added. Here is just an image of the Battle of Blackfire Pass, just to give you an idea of the scope of what was going on. Karl Franz arrived too late to help Marius, but did arrive and did win that battle in the end. Next up, we have Ludwig Schwarzhelm. Ludwig is the Emperor's champion, the sword of justice of the Empire, the Emperor's bodyguard as well. He's described as a stern man with a mighty physique, known as an incorruptible warrior, and has incredible martial skill. He's known as one of the 2 best swordsmen within the Empire itself. Him and Kurt Helborg, the leader of the Empire armies as a whole, split the honor between them. No one's sure necessarily who would win the fight, but they stand head and shoulders above any other challengers. They are known as the best swordsmen within the Empire and arguably in the whole of the old world itself. In terms of Ludwig's role, Ludwig often is sent out by the Emperor to make sure that his edicts are obeyed by the Elector Counts. He's that intimidating a figure. He's often turns up at Elector Counts' doors and they greet him with trepidation because he's known to take huge displeasure at any kind of lack of moral fiber or incredulity, and likes things done by the book, according to the law of Sigmar as well. He's a relatively pious man, and he likes to seek out and destroy corruption wherever he may find it. Because he is the Emperor's standard bearer, the role of the standard bearer needs to be looked into a little bit. On the tabletop, the standard bearer allows troops to re-roll morale leadership tests. So, as the standard bearer in Total War Warhammer, I'm not sure if you'd had him as a legendary lord by himself or maybe produce him as some kind of hero. These standards should maybe give an army-wide buff to morale for any army he's in, as he carries the Emperor's standard itself. So I can see them adding in him having a talent for increasing the morale of all the troops within the army, as opposed to just what you normally get around hero units, which is that kind of radius of morale boost. So I can see him doing that, so maybe it adds more leadership than your average general. An aspect of Ludwig also is that during trials by combat, which are a thing in the Empire, if you're found sort of guilty or accused of something and you're brought before the Emperor for justice and you demand a trial by combat, Ludwig will be the Emperor's champion, and his skill with the sword is so renowned that people would sooner confess than demand trial by combat. So trial by combat has gone down significantly in the, shall we say, the jurisdiction of the Emperor simply because of the presence of Ludwig. It was a much more commonplace before, whereas now people would not dare to demand trial by combat simply because they just know that they would lose to Ludwig. There's little question, so they'd sooner confess and take their punishment than demand trial by combat. Or if the Emperor maybe can't decide or there's insufficient evidence, maybe he'll declare trial by combat, in which case any lords, any nobles, anyone who's brought under the justice of the Emperor sooner confess than have to face Ludwig himself. Now, in his role as sort of enforcer, as sort of the upholder of the law for the Emperor, Ludwig's actually uncovered a couple of things. When he visited Ostland, for example, he encountered a branch of the von Reuken family, who the ruling family of Ostland had succumbed to a chaos cult. Now, he was in their castle at the time, surrounded by all their troops, and the entire family itself. And essentially an entire castle had turned on him upon his discovery of them being Chaos cultists and set upon trying to kill him. A day and a half later, Ludwig is the only man left standing in an entire castle of people, having managed to mow down all the guards, all the trespassing members of the family who had succumbed to the lull of chaos. And although battered and badly wounded, come dawn, he was the last man to walk out of said castle, earning his name as the Sword of Justice and upholder of the Emperor's word. In terms of his equipment, we've already discussed the Emperor's standard, but he's also equipped with, literally, a sword called the Sword of Justice. And it's been imbued with a number of dwarven runes, namely the dwarven runes for vengeance and for retribution. So I don't know if you'd maybe look to give him an ability that the dwarf runesmiths have. Maybe the direct damage one. The name escapes me right now, but something like that could be an interesting add for Ludwig, just from a lore point of view, and to maybe flush out his abilities a little bit. I think that might be an interesting addition. But that is Ludwig. Essentially the Emperor's bodyguard, his most trusted servant, his right-hand man, as it were. And he would make a very good addition. I think if you made that banner look amazing, the banner he holds with Emperor Karl Franz on it himself, I think that could look fantastic in Creative Assembly's sort of model rendering, and they could do a really good job of it. But looking forward to seeing him in the game, hopefully, at some point in the near future. Markus Wulfhart. Markus is a relatively new addition to Warhammer itself, the tabletop version, I believe. And Markus was heavily hinted at. People thought we'd see him in Total War Warhammer much earlier, because if any of you remember, during the tease before the Beastman came out, there was a reference to a letter to somebody asking the recipient of the letter to get their amber bow ready. And a lot of people thought that was Markus, because Markus is the chap who is armed with the legendary amber bow. Now, to give you a bit of history about Markus, Markus was born a commoner, which is quite unusual for the heroes of the Empire, but he was born a commoner in a village called Drakenberg in Middenland. This offers an interesting opportunity, because there are lots of hints in the game recently that CA are about to open up Middenland as its own faction. Then Markus may be, in fact, another legendary lord under the Middenland faction, because he's born there, and he's one of the few heroes of the Empire who are actually born in Middenland, apart from sort of Boris and things like that. But because he is born there, I think you could easily make him a legendary lord for Middenland, maybe not the Empire as a whole. As I said, he was born a commoner, and in his little village, he was just enjoying life. He was a hunter. He would just go about his daily business. And one day, a one-eyed bone grinder giant named the Drakewald Cyclops, because of its missing eye, set upon his village and killed everybody. Ate, consumed, just wrecked the place, killed everybody he could find, and left it in ruins. Markus returned, and he was consumed with hatred. He couldn't believe what had happened. All his loved ones had been killed. Everyone he'd ever known had been murdered or eaten by this giant. So he tracked it. He used the skills he has as a hunter, tracked it to its lair. Upon entering its lair, Markus quickly let loose an arrow that hit the Cyclops dead in its good eye. Blinding the Cyclops, in his fit of rage, Markus ran up with his blade drawn and started hacking at the Cyclops of Drakewald's legs, hacking at his hamstrings, which are described as being as thick as rope, and eventually slicing them off, bringing the giant down. Once the giant was down, Markus set about furiously hacking around its neck until he started to lose all feeling in his arm, and eventually managed to decapitate this monstrosity. Being just completely caked in the monster's blood, exhausted from battle, Markus still had not quenched the anger in his heart, and vowed to himself there in the lair of the Drakewald Cyclops that he would set about to ensure that this horror was never visited upon any other person in the Empire again, and vowed to kill all the monsters that lurk within the borders of the Empire. So he set off about his quest and started killing monsters everywhere he could find them. Eventually, the exploits of this hero of the woods reached the ears of Karl Franz, and Karl Franz summoned Markus before him. And Karl Franz at this point offered Markus a knighthood and the appropriate estates of someone of that position, essentially allowing Markus to retire and lead the good life. Markus, still consumed by his quest to end the lives of all monsters in the Empire, declined the Emperor's grand offer. So impressed with Markus's tenacity and quests for vengeance and to help secure the Empire's lands, that the Emperor then sent for one of the items from his vaults. The item itself was something called the Amber Bow, which had been enchanted by a wizard of the Amber Lore, or the Lore of Beast, as you may know it in Total War Warhammer. And this essentially allowed arrows fired from the bow to be guided towards the heart of any monster it was aimed at. The bow itself was made out of Drakwold wood, so very much from Markus's homeland, it suited him quite well. The way I'd like to see this bow implemented is if you maybe scale down the effect of the Amber Spear that Amber Wizards currently shoot, and then have that be the missiles that Markus shoots. I think that could look stunning in Total War Warhammer, just these amber arrows constantly flying out and having a bit of homing on them, maybe as much as the Hell Cannon even, just have that bit of movement in its flight to make sure it hits its target. I think would look fantastic and really be unique among the legendary lords in Total War Warhammer for the Empire, which tends to be a problem for the Empire. There's a lot of these, because it's all humans, a lot of them tend to be relatively similar, sort of armor-plated guys on horseback with a sword. So anything that can differentiate that a bit, I think, is more than welcome. And that's why I think Markus in particular is definitely going to be an addition at some point. And I'd like to maybe see him be an addition of Middenland rather than necessarily the Empire. But either way, I look forward to seeing him on the tabletop and having him be a sniper legendary lord, much like the Wood Elves have at the moment. Okay, that is essentially Markus's story. So moving on, next we have Luthor Huss. Now, Luthor's a bit of an interesting one because effectively he's just a kick-ass warrior priest. He'd also be the easiest one for Creative Assembly to implement. It's literally just the warrior priest model. Maybe you put a red cape on him or something, but all their work on Luthor would essentially be done. He doesn't look, it'd be quite hard to make him look particularly distinctive. Luthor's sort of original name and things have never really been known. As a boy, he turned up at a Sigmar temple in Nordland that was placed on top of cliffs overlooking the Sea of Claws. Now, the Sea of Claws is the body of water that separates Norseland from the Empire, where the sort of Norse tribes all habitate and cross over to raid into the Empire. So the suggestion here is perhaps that Luthor was originally born from a Norse tribe and had maybe swam across or been shipwrecked and had found his way to a temple of Sigmar. So the boy arrives at the temple of Sigmar and slightly reluctantly, but still they take him in. And he's taken in by the head of the temple, who is a priest called Theus, I believe it's pronounced. I'm not sure about that. But Theus takes him in, and Luthor soon sets about his tasks and learning about Sigmar and learning about the faith. And he undertakes any duty assigned to him and asks to do more and helps clean up. And he launches into the study of Sigmar with a fervor that is rarely seen among the acolytes of Sigmar. Often because he's working so hard and being a bit of a arse kisser, the other boys beat him up. But soon enough, as the years go by, Luthor grows to be amongst the physically most intimidating member of the acolytes of Sigmar studying at the temple. And he starts to really excel at the studies of Sigmar, at martial combat, at all the things that make a warrior priest of Sigmar a warrior priest. And he starts to stand out and is soon the top acolyte at the temple. Theus, the old temple master, takes him in, starts to teach him, starts to take him out on the road, and they have a number of encounters, and it's sort of Luthor's first exposure to the real world. And he has experiences where he meets a beautiful young woman and she dies, and he tries to bring her back, and he learns that priests aren't necessarily healers, but we try and take care and fortify the strength of the living and try and help them. And essentially goes through a number of adventures with Theus, and they grow very close, and essentially Theus becomes his sort of one-on-one mentor, and Theus sees him as the heir to the temple. And the years go by, and eventually Luthor becomes a fully fledged warrior priest. As sort of Luthor's strength grows, as the years roll on, so does Theus's weaken, and is starting to become an old man, and age is starting to tell on him. And at some point, he becomes bedridden. There's been a report of a chaos entity in a nearby village. So he sends Luthor out to deal with it, to try and get rid of it and to rid the area of the Chaos Scourge. So he hands Luthor his hammer and says, take this. It's a very touching moment between the two of them, sort of the passing of the torch, as it were, or the passing of the hammer. And he says, Luthor, by the time you return, I'm dead. I want you to take over the temple. So Luthor sort of takes this, heads off to do his duty and get rid of the chaos corruption. So Luthor meets, I think it's a demon of sorts, or a very highly corrupted beastman, or something along those lines. I'm not 100% sure on what exactly the threat is that he deals with, but he manages to defeat it in combat. It does poison him and it injures him, and it slows his return back to the temple, but he's keen to get back as quickly as he can so he doesn't miss the passing of his old teacher, his old master. Upon his return to the temple, the old priest is taken aback, maybe slightly surprised to see Luthor. And Luthor sees the old priest kneeling at an altar covered in bones, wearing black robes, and the priest looks like he did when he was young. And there are chaos sigils in the Temple of Sigmar, and Luthor is taken over by a wave of rage, of a feeling of betrayal, and immediately sets upon his old master. He eventually manages to defeat him, and then has to face a number of acolytes in the temple who have also turned to chaos. He eventually defeats them, a fire breaks out in the temple, and come nightfall, Luthor is the last one standing as the temple he grew up in burns all around him. He walks out of the temple bemused and completely baffled by the fact that he'd missed the corruption that had been surrounding him. So ensconced was he in his own studies and his own life and his own way of doing things that he had completely missed that all those all around him had started to turn to the ways of chaos. And he set out on his journeys knowing that he'd never really have a proper home again, renewing his vows to seek out corruption wherever it lay, particularly if it lay within the hearts of warrior priests themselves. And this starts off a trend where there are a number of suspected warrior priests who have been killed at the feet of Luthor, who have been maybe suspected of chaos corruption, but then to the head of the church at the Temple of Sigmar in Altdorf hasn't necessarily been proved outright. So as far as they're concerned, Luthor's going around killing other warrior priests. It gets to such a degree that there are reports coming back, and one of the archlectors actually asked Volkmar the Grim to excommunicate Luthor. And every time this is brought up, Volkmar just sort of puts on a little wry smile, as if to say, I sort of trust in Luthor, or I have an idea that destiny has great things in store for him as a warrior priest, and has never sort of even entertained the idea of excommunicating Luthor Huss. Now, at some point on his adventures, Luthor encounters a farm boy who, by stories the locals tell, had fought off an entire chaos war herd by himself. And he takes the boy in, and he remarkably finds that the boy bears the mark of Sigmar, the mark of the twin-tailed comet. And he says to the boy, you are the reincarnation of Sigmar himself. Let me take you to Altdorf, where you should be crowned the new emperor, because you are Sigmar reborn. I have found you. I have found you reincarnated on Earth to save us all. Let's go. So him and Valten go off to see Karl Franz. And I'll leave the rest of that story for Valten's segment or Legendary Lore video. But essentially, Luthor is just a badass, take no shit warrior priest who will, even if he mildly sniffs chaos on you, will take you down. He's become uncompromising. Everyone he's ever been close to has died or been killed, and he's sort of vowed to himself never to get that close to people, but to try and put himself emotionally over them, to try and help reinforce the weaknesses in them with his own personal strength. But he's essentially a hugely pious zealot of Sigmar, is who Luthor Huss is. And most of the role he plays, and most of the sort of the destiny that seems to be playing out, is him finding this Valten kid and bringing him to the attention of the Empire at whole. So that's it for Luthor Huss. There is a whole book about him, and I have skipped over a lot of the detail of that. He does have an adventure. He has a sort of a face-off against a Bray shaman and a Bray herd in the Drakewald forest that is written about in this novel. Do pick it up. I think it's an okay story. It's interesting if you like the idea of Luthor Huss. Let's say that. But I didn't really delve too much into that. This was more of a broad strokes overview of Luthor and his role in the Empire. So, moving on, we have Valten himself. Now, as I mentioned, Luthor found Valten shortly after he had attacked or fought off a Chaos War herd or a Bray herd by himself. So Valten was born in a little village called Lachenbad. He was born in a little village called Lachenbad in Reichland. He was the son of a blacksmith and had grown up learning the trade. He was born with the twin-tailed comet birthmark, the sign of Sigmar, upon his chest. And at first, the villagers didn't know what to make of this. Some of them thought it was a bad omen and he should be thrown out of the village and drowned in a river as a baby. Some thought this was a sign from Sigmar and the boy would be blessed. No one really knew what to make of it. But as he grew up larger and stronger than the other boys, with a quick mind. He quickly picked up anything that was put in front of him and learnt the ways of it very quickly. He was intelligent and incredibly strong, and really started to shine growing into his life as an adult. So upon his 18th birthday, this Bray herd attack his village, and they start to kill everybody. It gets really bad, and Valten grabs 2 hammers from his father's forge and just starts crushing skulls left and right, heading straight towards the leader of the Beast Lord in charge of the Bray herd, and he's smashing, and there's just a trail of destruction in his wake of broken bones and shattered skulls. And this action provokes the other villagers, it inspires them, and they sort of grab weapons and help out how they can to fight off this enormous beast herd that had fallen upon them. So they reinforce Valten. Valten kills the Beast Lord. In his battle with the Beast Lord, who was called Ragrath, Valten was actually injured. He was sliced across the chest and across his birthmark, but he still managed to defeat the Beast Lord and win the day. The Bray herd scatter, the day is won. And that's Valten in his kind of first iteration. Now, Luthor Huss, the zealot, the prophet, the self-proclaimed prophet of Sigmar, hears about these stories and comes to find Valten. Upon seeing the mark on his chest and his likeness to Sigmar himself, he proclaims that Valten is Sigmar reborn and takes him to see the Emperor. Now, the interesting thing about Valten in the Total War Warhammer tabletop is he came in sort of 3 different forms at the 3 different stages of his life. So there's the younger Valten, who you can see here in the middle of the models, who's portrayed with the 2 hammers from his father's forge, having just fought off the Beastman horde. Now, just to sidestep a little bit from this point, Valten was a character originally created during a Games Workshop event called the Storm of Chaos, where they asked tabletop players to play battles and they'd accumulate the results and then write that into the story of the Storm of Chaos. And essentially what happened was, I think for several reasons, Chaos wasn't a very popular army at the time. It wasn't, maybe it was slightly underpowered even. So people tended not to play as Chaos very much. And Chaos happened to always lose. So when people were sending in their results, it turned into the worst Chaos invasion ever. So Games Workshop sort of wrote themselves into some kind of stupidness where Valten ended up facing up against Archaon and sort of half beating him or knocking him into Grimgor, who then kicked Archaon in the nuts, and that was the end of the story. This was a disaster, nobody liked it, so Games Workshop have since gone back and retconned that the Storms of Chaos never happened. And much later we got the End Times, which again one could describe as a disaster in its own right. But that aside, essentially the story of Valten changes slightly in its details. But let's say to this point where Luthor Huss takes Valten to see Karl Franz, that's still in the lore, I think. And I think though Karl Franz isn't dealing with a Chaos invasion, he just doesn't want a civil war in the Empire. Because if the church says that this guy should be emperor and Karl Franz says he should be emperor, it would split the empire in 2, it would cause a civil war. So the diplomat that he is, Karl Franz sidesteps the issue slightly. He says, oh my god, you're right, Valten, Sigmar reborn, this is amazing. I shall give Valten Galmaraz, the hammer of Sigmar himself, and Valten shall be the head of the church of Sigmar, the spiritual head of the empire. Let's do that, and I'll stay emperor, and that's how things will go from here on in. And the Church of Sigmar and Luthor Huss accept this and like, okay, fair enough. And it's really a very depth way for Karl Franz to avert civil war and really just deal with the situation quite nicely. Now, because Valten was invented during this Storms of Chaos segment, he does go through several iterations of what his model looks like, and there are several sets of rules depending on the model you pick for Valten. So when he's given Galmaraz, he becomes the model you see on the right. So he's holding Galmaraz, no longer the two hammers from his father's forge. Galmaraz is now the weapon he uses, and he marches into battle with just some Imperial armor. That's how he goes. Now, the story was in the Storms of Chaos that Valten then led the armies of the Empire against Archaon and his armies at the time during the Storms of Chaos story. They eventually march to Talabecland, where they meet up with some dwarves, and the dwarves present Valten with this armor of Gromril, which was essentially, according to the dwarves, an armor they'd made for Sigmar, but had never had the opportunity to present to him. So this is armor that's been lying around for 2,500 years, but because it's made by master dwarven craftsmen of millennia ago, it's still perfectly usable and in great shape and would ward off most things that would attack him. And the High Elves make a gift to Valten as well. They offer him Alfandin, his elven horse, who is sired from the horse of the elven prince Tyklis, I think. So he eventually gets upgraded to this point where he has Galmaraz, he has this magical dwarven armor, he has this magical elven horse essentially, and that's him fully equipped, and he grows out a great beard in the meantime as well, as you can see by the models. So I hope they do get Valten in the game. I know Storms of Chaos has since been retconned out of existence, and Valten did he did essentially kill a lot of Chaos heroes during the end times, and eventually didn't succeed but died, and then that played a role in the actual resurrection of Sigmar in the body of Karl Franz. Forget about that. I don't like the end times. I like to ignore it in my videos. But Valten is a bit of an odd character because he was created for one purpose, had a story. That story was then mostly thrown away, but he's still a character that they're allowed to use on the tabletop. So essentially what I'd like to see is keep the origin story that he fought off the Beastmen. In Total War Warhammer, what I'd like to see his incarnation being is maybe the younger Valten. So with the two hammers, maybe a bit more of a frenzied lord. He has sort of low armor, but does huge amounts of damage. And then maybe he can get Galmaraz later on, but still maybe on foot, maybe gets the horse, but for the most part is unarmored, has his father's hammers, doesn't have the beard, is the younger version of Valten, just to differentiate him from all the other sort of horse-riding, armored legendary lords that the Empire has. Maybe make him a bit different. So I think the younger Valten with the two hammers, charging at enemies, doing huge amounts of damage, but not having much armor himself, I think that could be a great version of him to include in Total War Warhammer. I think he is an interesting character. It's just a shame all his lore is tied up in these kind of two failed or unappreciated or unliked narrative events, namely the Storms of Chaos and the End Times. But I think at its heart, the origin story of Valten is pretty good, and I do hope they keep it and implement it in Total War Warhammer at some point. There is a mod out there that implements a kind of version of Valten as a hero. You guys should check that out on Total War Warhammer, and I have fiddled around with it. I tend not to use it, but it is a pretty good mod, and it does exist. So just to make you guys aware of that, if you want him in your game immediately. Okay, so after Valten, we have Elspeth von Draken, otherwise known as the Dark Lady of Nuln. And now this is a bit of a caveat, really, because Elspeth is what is known as a Forge Worlds character. Now, Forge Worlds, I don't know if it started off as a separate company or was always an offshoot of Games Workshop, but now is an offshoot of Games Workshop. And essentially what they do is they create slightly more detailed models than Games Workshop for specific characters and specific armies. And Elspeth is one of their models, so kind of official character, but not really. And I'm not sure if CA, so far as I'm aware, have not yet included any of the Forge World characters in Total War Warhammer. But I think Elspeth might be included simply because she is a good sort of champion of the lore of Amethyst, or the lore of death as magician. She's head of the School of Amethyst order within the Empire. So Amethyst is death magic, essentially, and she's the head of the Amethyst wizards within the Empire. If you've seen my missing units video at all, missing units from Total War Warhammer, you'll note that there's essentially one law of magic missing from the Empire as the game currently stands, and that is the Amethyst Wizard. So Elspeth might be included when they include those wizards, that lore of wizards. She herself is mounted upon a dragon known as a Carmine Dragon. Now, Carmine Dragons are essentially dragons who, in their egg, have been overly exposed to the winds of magic of death. And it's kind of changed the way they appear, and they're born sort of crimson red, and they stay red, and as they mature, that redness turns into a more purplish hue, a more purplish color. They're not necessarily evil dragons, they just don't look like uncorrupted dragons. They look slightly different, look a bit more aggressive. The dragon under Elspeth is controlled by her and does fight for the Empire. It's not she hasn't tamed a chaos dragon or anything like that. It's just a dragon, essentially a dragon born with a mild mutation by being overexposed to the winds of magic of death, really. Now, Elspeth herself is a bit of a controversial figure within the Empire. Although she is head of an entire lore of magic, she's not really trusted. Balthasar Gelt himself, the head of all magic within the Empire, likes to keep a very close eye on her. He doesn't entirely trust her. He sends his spies out to just keep tabs on her and see what she's up to. She is based out of Nullen herself, and she has a tower that overlooks the Gardens of Mor. Now, Mor is the god of death in the Empire, sort of litany of gods. So Mor is very much of the angel of death, or the god of death, however you want to see him. And she lives right next to the Gardens of Mor, which I think could be interpreted as a graveyard. I'm not 100% sure on that, but she's described as living near the Gardens of Mor. She's had a number of different times when she's risen to the occasion and defended the Empire, because although she does deal with this not looked down upon, but people are very suspicious of the lore of death within the Empire. And although she specializes in this form of magic, she has ever been a scion of the Empire and does come to its defense when called upon. A couple of notable occasions when she's risen to the defense of the Empire have been with the appearance of Maya Hulk Rawbones, who was somebody who kept looking for villagers to make blood sacrifices to them for his protection. So this guy was going to villages, murdering people unless they made blood sacrifices to him, like gave human sacrifices, and Elspeth was the one to root him out and kill him. She's also known for taking down a Lamian vampire known as Vishara, who sought to corrupt the Jagabab family of Fildorf, and she rode to their rescue and killed that Lamian vampire. Now, herself is come under suspicion because she does have such a pale face and has not seemingly aged for many decades. So there's maybe a suspicion that she's a vampire herself, although that has never been proved and no one knows this. And considering she's taken action against vampires in the past, I think that sort of assuaged the suspicion slightly. But people are still concerned that she's lived so long and always had the same face, not seem to have aged a single day. It's raised a lot of eyebrows within the Empire. Elspeth comes from a noble line herself, descending from a long lineage of magic users. Some have been known as saviors, some as monsters, but she is well respected amongst, well, let's say magical families within the Empire itself. She's also an avid collector of magical artifacts and all things magic. In terms of her appearance, she often appears in black robes, maybe with a purplish hue from time to time. She has, in terms of her war gear, the pale scythe, which when you see it in real life looks like it's made more of shadow than of any actual substance of man. And she also has an item called the Death Timekeeper, the sands of which, essentially it's an hourglass, the sands of which are rumored to be made of the remains of one of the world's old gods. And she uses that to control both time and death to a certain degree. Now that opens up the possibility of her maybe having an ability to slow down units, irrespective of a magic spell or the winds of magic. I think that would be a cool use of the Death Timekeeper. I think that would be really cool. But yeah, as the Amethyst Wizard, as the head of the Amethyst Order, she looks very much like the Angel of Death herself, with her scythe upon her dragon and her hourglass. A very intimidating character, and one that I think would be very unique and be very cool in Total War Warhammer. But as I said, they haven't really enforced any Forge World characters as of yet. Maybe this will be the first. Let's see, fingers crossed. And that sums up my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Empire Edition. As I said, there are a number of other characters and elector counts that exist within the Empire, but they weren't included in the 8th edition of the Empire Army book, so I haven't necessarily included them in this video. I will maybe cover different characters in different aspects of lore. I do intend to do lore videos on the different provinces of the Empire, and a lot of them will be covered in that. But for the moment, I hope you guys enjoyed this list of the missing legendary lords. Do let me know if I've missed any characters you'd like to see in the game in the future, and let me know if I've missed any details that you guys think are important to the legendary lords I mentioned. Other than that, please do subscribe for more lore videos and more missing units videos for Total War Warhammer, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thank you very much.